We're now going to begin our first panel discussion of the day, focused on the critical topic of value assessments in Alzheimer's. It's led by Lydia Landman, a friend, a CEOI member, and the senior global policy leader at Roche. Lydia, take it off. Take it on. Go.
Thank you, George. Thank you, George. It's a pleasure to be here today. Good afternoon and good morning. I'm really pleased to be moderating this panel on new value approaches in Alzheimer's disease. So far in Lausanne, this is our last day, we've seen discussions about the need for global collaboration to accelerate, scale, and deploy solutions and tools, future diagnostic tools and treatments, and how we can improve post-diagnostic treatment and care. Today, as we've heard from the previous speaker, we're focusing on how to define and assess the value of Alzheimer's innovations. With new disease-modifying therapies on the very new horizon, how healthcare systems and payers assess the value of new DMTs for Alzheimer's will play a significant role in determining who may be able to access and benefit from future treatment and care. The significant impact on people living with the disease, their families and caregivers, as well as on societies, often eclipses the impact the disease has on direct healthcare costs. And to that, the intersection of socioeconomic and other disparities, traditional value assessment models used in health technology assessment may not be equipped to consider the full scope of the value that new AD treatments bring. All that said, we're in for what will probably be a very lively and spirited debate over where current approaches to value assessment fall short for Alzheimer's disease, what is needed to change, and how we can get there. So I'm pleased to be joined today by four panelists who I am now will ask to briefly introduce themselves. First, I'd like to start with Anders Gustafson. Anders, take it away.
Unmute. Sorry. Thank you, Lydia, and many thanks for inviting me to this panel. My name is Anders Gustafson. I'm a Swede. I'm a co-founder of Quantify Research, a Swedish-based consultancy, and also affiliated researcher at Karolinska Institute. I've been working with Alzheimer's disease for the last 15 years as a health economist. And I'm also a member of PAVE, Project Alzheimer Value Europe, and I've been coordinating a study there on the epidemiology of Alzheimer's disease. So I'm happy to talk more about that in a short bit.
Great, thank you, Anders. Really looking forward to hearing more about the insights from the new epi work that PAVE and the study authors have done. Soren, over to you next.
Yeah, good morning, good afternoon. Soren Matke, University of Southern California in Los Angeles, where it is still dark and cold this morning, but it's still a pleasure to be here. I've been busying myself for the last few years looking into how health systems are prepared for the arrival of an Alzheimer's treatment. And of course, as you know, the answer is not positive. And one of the items in which we are not prepared is the finances, because there is no way around it. It is going to cost a lot of money to treat Alzheimer's disease. It's extremely prevalent. These are fairly sophisticated treatments, and like we do in oncology, immunology, and other disorders, we will have to find the money to finance those. And I've tried to build the case for, much like the previous speaker, so what's the economic argument to finance access to those treatments? And we're currently working on applying the ISPOR value flower as a broader assessment of value to a hypothetical Alzheimer's treatment.
Thanks, Soren. And Bruce Pineson, over to you.
Thank you very much, and Lydia, it's a pleasure to be in this panel. I'm a principal and consulting actuary at Milliman, which is a firm of largely focused on actuarial, and we consult throughout the healthcare sector. I've been doing this kind of work for about 35 years. And involved with all sorts of therapeutic analytics, as well as consulting to risk takers, insurance companies, and the accountable care organizations that are taking risk. I also have another position as a commissioner on MedPAC, the Medicare Payment Advisory Commission, an agency of U.S. Congress. Needless to say, what I'm going to my opinions are my own and not those of those organizations. I've been involved with the Alzheimer's issue and other value issues for recently publishing a paper on an alternative value approach, more of a social value approach, and earlier had published on longitudinal tracking of the Alzheimer's patients using U.S. Medicare data. So again, my pleasure to be with you today.
Great, thanks. Really look forward to digging more into the longitudinal view as well as the social value approach. And last but not least, David Thomas.
Hello, thank you, Lydia, and hello, everyone. Delighted to be on this panel with you today. So my name is David Thomas. I am Head of Policy for Access and Innovation at Alzheimer's Research UK. So we are a charitable funder of research into dementia, and also a group that looks to represent the views and experiences of patients and carers and people affected by dementia. And alongside the work that we do to fund and support the development of new treatments, a big focus for us in recent years has been how we can prepare the UK system for a potential disease-modifying treatment, to understand some of those barriers and to look at what solutions that we can develop to tackle those barriers. And value assessment is one that we have identified and have been working on over the last couple of years, in particular working with a larger coalition of patient organisations to see how we can work in partnership with our local HTA body, NICE, to alter their approach and ensure that the patients are more easily able to access the treatments which they need.
Great, thank you, David. Really looking forward to hear about some of the progress that's being made in the UK and where NICE may be heading as one of the leading HTA bodies in the world. So as I promised, this is going to be a good debate. So in good debate fashion, I'm going to ask all of our panelists the same question, and would love kind of each of your perspectives on it. So given the complex impact of dementia on society, which we heard earlier from David Bloom, is traditional cost effectiveness analysis a suitable tool to assess the value of an Alzheimer's treatment? And I guess really the question for me is, do we need to abandon traditional cost effectiveness analysis altogether, or can it be salvaged and adjusted? So I'm going to kick us off. We'll start with Soren.
Yeah, thank you, Lydia. And my probably not well-liked answer in the UK is clearly not, because the method just doesn't do justice to a treatment that is not incremental. We published yesterday a blog in Health Affairs that speaks in great length about the problem that cost effectiveness analysis doesn't really mean that a drug is saving money or has absolute value. It's an incremental measure. It looks at the gain in quality of life, quality adjusted life years that a treatment conveys, and compares that to the incremental cost of the treatment. So in other words, if the incremental costs are low, the gains have to be enormous to justify a high price. Conversely, if your baseline price is already very high, you don't have to gain a lot in terms of treatment effect to make it cost effective. You see that in, say, immunology, right? We get every year slightly better treatments for psoriasis or inflammatory bowel disease, certainly a worthy cause, but these treatments in the US are like $80,000, $85,000 a year, and just sort of have a marginal effect because their comparator are things like Enbrel, Humira that are already like $60,000 to $70,000 a year. In Alzheimer's, this doesn't really work because your treatment is tender loving care. That's your standard of care. Go home, get your affairs in order, organize your finances, don't do any stupid stuff. If you compare to that as standard of care, any treatment is going to be enormously expensive no matter how it is priced. So an incremental method, in my view, is certainly not suitable if progress is non-incremental, as we now see in Alzheimer's disease.
Great, thanks, Soren. I think we want to dig into your health affairs blog a bit more later, but Anders, your thoughts. Can cost effectiveness analysis be salvaged? Does it need to be abandoned completely?
Yeah, thank you, Lydia. I'm not sure it needs to be abandoned. I think we can do a better job within the current framework. I share a lot of the critique and understand a lot of the critique. And of course, it's not the perfect system, the cost effectiveness analysis, but I'm not sure this is a technical issue. I am more interested in discussing sort of the underlying premise of this. What is it that makes the cost effectiveness analysis not optimal? And I think we can do a better job in having a long-term perspective and a societal perspective, and making sure that we include the broad perspective when evaluating new drugs. And there, the methods are available, but I think we can make better use of this. Yeah, I'll stop there now.
No, good. We'll kind of dig into what can make it more optimal maybe a bit later, Anders. Thank you. And Bruce, would love to hear your perspective on this, given especially your work on kind of longitudinal as well as social value.
Well, let me start by saying I have the luxury of not being an economist. I'm an actuary, so I'm perhaps not bound by some of the approaches that traditionally have been used in economics. And I start by saying that now is the time to start to work on an alternative framework. I think the current framework, based on qualities and based on what I call traditional economic fair wager kind of approaches, is really fundamentally flawed. We don't have a ready replacement at the moment, so we're going to have to use some of the existing tools. But what's happened in economics in the last several years is the emergence of behavioral economics, where people have discovered that human beings don't act the way economists think they should act, and therefore the models that economists had for the way people should act aren't a good representation of reality, and I think they're not a good representation of policy. So you have a number of very flawed components, qualities, which are an attempt to create a omnibus measure of very important human concerns, and adding those up in a simplistic arithmetic way is pretty flawed fundamentally. So the analogs that we have suggest that societies don't and have not measured what's important or their investments in this kind of methodology. So we should actually stop the pretense that we're going to do that going forward. A notable example is every society is committed to helping developmentally disabled individuals on a quality of life basis. That would not be done in the simplistic way that we have it. So the reality is society doesn't make its decisions based on that. So we should stop the pretense that we need to do that for innovation or healthcare in general. Obviously, we need to make decisions. My view is that value is something that's determined, is a societal value, and that should be distinct from the issue of who pays and who gets paid, and even how much they get paid. So let's separate those issues and not try to smush a primitive, imperfect system to solve it all at once. So sorry for the long-winded response, but again, I apologize for my friends who are economists, but I actually have the luxury not coming from that background.
No, and it's really great to kind of have this perspective, Bruce, and I think for challenging maybe some of the work that ourselves as economists do. So David, Bruce has talked about kind of antiquated approaches, these traditional approaches, a desire to separate out social value versus other kind of value measures. How does this play out in the UK, given that you do have NICE, who's really been championing, cost effectiveness analysis as part of HTA?
Yeah, thank you, Lydia. And I'm also not an economist, but I think it is pretty fundamental, that model, to the approach that the UK is taking when looking at how it assesses medicine. And but I mean, to go back to your original question, I think our view is that yes, there are, and as has already been articulated, there are real shortcomings in this approach for multiple disease areas, but Alzheimer's in particular. And I'd emphasise the point that Soren made around, in this particular area, the majority of those costs are picked up informally and not by the healthcare service. So it is something that needs a different approach. I guess that I'm a pragmatist though, and recognizing how you move away from that model, that there's an argument you need to make in the UK, and I guess in other places as well, about the shortcomings. But there's also a need to suggest alternatives to that, and I think that's what this session could be really useful for, is to outline what could replace this model. How do we? I think use the word salvaged. I personally think that we could salvage this, and that there's a evolution, not revolution, is what's needed here, at least here in the UK. And I guess my first thought on that would be that we need to have a sort of multi-stakeholder approach to values, a shared approach to defining value across the system. So not just HTA bodies, but also how payers approach it, how industry approaches it, and also how patients and people affected by the condition approaches it. So I think that's for me the starting point of solutions, is how we bring everyone together to come up with a common approach to value.
No, and that's a really great segue. I don't think we actually, all of us, kind of landed on the same side of the fence, whether it should be totally killed, abandoned, or I think we really kind of said there's probably areas where it can be improved. And so just kind of a follow-up question for all of you. What do you think is needed to estimate the value of new AD treatments in a more transparent, objective, holistic way that really goes on to capture that full value of slowing cognitive decline? And so, Bruce, I'd love you to weigh in first on this one.
Well, just a technical point. I'm not sure slowing cognitive decline is the only or even the most important component of an effective Alzheimer's treatment. And the reason for that is when we think of the impact of Alzheimer's, and there's a whole ecosystem of support for Alzheimer's patients. There's profound impacts on caregivers, spouses, family members, and others. And many of those impacts are associated with things other than cognitive decline. It might be behavioral issues and so forth. So I think to be more transparent about it, is to think about what the impact on that whole ecology is, or that segment of supports, and to value that. So I think in the US we have a strangely fragmented system where the social supports are not considered medical care, so they don't get counted. That perhaps is different in other countries. So the issue of trying to tally up the totality of burden and the totality of how that burden might be eased by some therapies or treatments, I think that is a more holistic approach of getting at value.
Great, thanks, Bruce. And David, back to you in terms of how do you get at that more kind of holistic view of value, particularly if you are working with a group like NICE, who is taking a more traditional view? What are some of those improvements that could be made?
Yeah, so I think, there's a range of different things, aren't there? But I guess one of the things that I think is really important is around how you reflect the outcomes that matter to people living with dementia. And I think Bruce touched on that this is not just about slowing the disease, but it's also around the impacts like on someone's sleep or issues around agitation. So I think starting with those outcomes, what matters, and incentivizing them, and that's obviously a bigger problem than just HTA. That's something for industry and for regulators as well. So I think that in terms of that's the central role of people affected by the condition to this process. I think that's a useful starting point. I do think as well that to emphasise there is a much more progress needed on this around the impact that that Alzheimer's has on carers and those who are giving the people with dementia support. So I think that's a really important area that needs to understand the impact on their quality of life and how that is factored into the process. I guess the third thing I would touch on, I suppose, is uncertainty. That I think there are a lot of uncertainties that are posed by by potential medicine in this area, and from experience of talking to HTA bodies here in the UK, they don't like uncertainty. But it's how you can have an approach that both factors in the uncertainties around the natural history of the disease in terms of the progression of Alzheimer's and how varied that is within each individual. It's also how you capture that data as it is evolving from a particular product, and that we might not see the kind of clear picture over 2, 3, 5 years time. So how I think part of that is an assumption of uncertainty and putting the right sort of measures and processes in place that kind of deal agnostically with that uncertainty, rather than starting with uncertainty means we can't understand the value of this and therefore it's not cost effective.
Thanks, David. Soren, how would you go about kind of addressing those kind of challenges around uncertainty, this incrementalism that you've talked about, as well as kind of this long view, right? Not being really able to know what the total value of those benefits will be for a very long period of time. Would love your thoughts on this.
I mean, uncertainty is just a statistical phenomenon, so we can give confidence intervals. That doesn't trouble me too much. I'm still hung up on this incremental nature, and I will have to go full ivory tower on you this morning. So I really like the ISPOR value flower because of its sort of broader approach to value. But it is still done by health economists. So they are still trying to salvage the underlying incrementalist problem, because economists by default are trained to look at marginal effects. So they put in all kinds of things that make total sense intuitively. And by that, they're actually abandoning, in my mind, traditional economic theory and move us into a more Rawlsian world, if you will. So the famous philosopher John Rawls has said, behind the veil of ignorance, we are all inclined to choose a world in which we have sort of equality of opportunity, not equality of outcomes as it is currently promulgated in the US, but equality of opportunity. And that is what Bruce alluded to. We are treating people with severe hereditary conditions, even though economists would tell you it's a total waste of money because they're not gaining a lot of QALYs. We're just prolonging in their mind, useless life because it's sort of not worth it. And so the value flower has concepts like equity considerations. They haven't proposed how to operationalize it. They have proposed the value of scientific spillovers, like how does a new drug, a totally new drug that is non-incremental, stimulate research and development in a therapeutic area. Haven't proposed to operationalize it, but these are all concepts that go beyond incrementalism and sort of abandon cost effectiveness analysis as we know it. We just haven't got to a point, like Bruce said, with a framework how to replace it.
Oh, thanks, Soren. And Anders, I'd love kind of your reaction, I think, as a health economist to some of the things that are non-health economists, but also kind of Soren through it. I didn't think would be quoting kind of roles in this session, but glad to hear it. So yeah, Anders, love your thoughts.
Yeah, thanks. No, I appreciate all the critique, and I don't need to defend that much. My case is simply that, sure, there are values that we are missing. I really think this innovation piece is important. I'm really excited now about the recent events in Alzheimer's and new therapeutics coming, because I think it's sort of this innovation will spur investments and us moving. It gives us tempo to increase our knowledge in AD. So I really agree that innovation is something that the cost effectiveness analysis doesn't capture in a good way. There is piece of this. I think when it comes to considering different willingness to pay thresholds for different severities, and whether there are in Sweden, for instance, the TLV looks at whether there are treatment alternatives, and if there's no treatment alternative, they have a higher willingness to pay. So there is not intrinsic in the cost effectiveness analysis, but still there are means to address such issues even within this framework. And again, I think my main case is that I think we can do so much better already within this model by looking at this long term. Ideas there could be to look at the discounting. Is it really fair to discount the values of future outcomes in the way we do? I think now with COVID and climate change and all this, we sort of we get to remember that we are in this for the long run, and we need to take that into account also, the values that will accrue in 20 years or 30 years. We cannot just discount it away. Another is the for the long-term perspective. I think it's back to the severity, that we should consider the severity over the longer term also, not just considering that, for instance, a prodromal AD person does not really have a lot of severity today, but obviously over time we will expect a lot of severity, a severe disease, and that needs to be accounted for. And we have that in methods like absolute shortfall and their alternatives also. So I think there are sort of fixes to some of these problems, and we can make more use of those. And then again, the societal perspective that David talked about a lot also. We need to take into account the caregiver's perspective, and that could be done both on the cost side and the health side, on the quality side. Again, not perfect, but still you can include it.
Well, I know none of this, there's always, what did it say? I think most economic models, there's always a model to explain the model, right? I think I learned that from you, Anders. And so it sounds like there are some ability, right? There's some ways to kind of improve within the current constructs. I think what I'm hearing is that it just takes the will and the willingness to do so. But I think that, there's an opportunity there. And so Anders, I'd like to kind of dig in a bit more about, some of the work that you've been doing along with some co-authors and European clinical experts as part of your work with PAVE and the EPI work. Does this help us kind of understanding better the prevalence of AD? Does this help when we look at kind of assessing value of new therapies going forward?
Sure, to some extent, yes. It's a good foundation, I think. We realized quite early in the PAVE initiative that we didn't have a good understanding of the pre-dementia stages of Alzheimer's disease, and how many are there actually that could be eligible for treatment if a disease-modifying treatment comes. So we did a study on that, estimating the number of persons across the Alzheimer continuum. And we concluded that if we have 32 million people with AD dementia in the world, we have 69 million prodromal AD. And 315 in the preclinical AD stage. So 92% of all with an underlying Alzheimer pathology, 92% of those, they don't even have dementia. And those are the ones that are studied and included in both the burden prevalence studies and the cost studies and so forth. And if we're going to start to treat those patients early enough to actually see a benefit, disease-modifying benefit, then we need to understand who those people are, right? And with these extremely large numbers also, we need to understand who we should treat first. We can't put them on treatment, everyone, right? So we need to study them and see who should we start treating and when to stop treatment. So I think based on this, we sort of both can grasp the magnitude of the problem. I think Dave Bloom said before also that we have underestimated the burden of the disease, and that causes us to sort of underinvest in Alzheimer's also. And I really believe that. So this is a good foundation, I think.
Yeah, and I guess also to kind of understand the full prevalence, but also to understand how that patient moves from one disease state to the next and who's most likely to move and when, right? This is also very important when you're looking at the value of various interventions, whether they be non-pharmaceutical interventions, for that kind of really prodromal kind of AD stage, or, therapeutic interventions as we get into kind of like mild cognitive and early AD. And it looks like Soren, you have your hand up.
Yeah, Your Honor, I just wanted to state for the record that the defendant of cost effectiveness analysis has acknowledged the need for absolute measures rather than incremental measures.
Thank you for pointing that out, Soren. Hopefully it doesn't cause any more kind of rift in the panel. And so, Anders, also I'd love to kind of like hear about, are there, I guess, challenges in assessing this long-term kind of value in the real world setting. So I think, a lot of the epi data is really drawn from clinical trial data, right? And registries and cohorts and various databases, which we all know don't always reflect what's actually happening in the real world and how kind of a real person living with AD moves through the different stages of their disease. So what are ways that can we approach this kind of to get a longer term view, but also maybe a more precise view that can really inform HTA assessment?
I think it's obvious to everyone that once a treatment gets on the market, that will need to be evaluated and followed up with careful data collection. And that will likely happen. But I think it's important that we see these initiatives, and we do already now, to have the historical patient. David said earlier that we need to understand the disease progression better, the natural of the disease, and I think our ability to do this improves over time. We have more and more collaborations across the borders and across different industry and public payers, academia, and so forth. And also with the digitalization of data collection and biomarkers and digital biomarkers and these digital cognitive batteries and functional assessments that are not that dependent on a research nurse spending time on this, but rather we can dig into this data much more efficiently. I think now we can form these big registers that we can capture the full heterogeneity of these patients and see how they progress over time, untreated and later on treated also. But we need that investment already now.
Yeah, and I think that was some of the discussion on day 2 of Lausanne when we were looking at different kind of diagnostic innovation, whether it be, digital, kind of more passive patient information collection, tracking kind of the passive changes that happen in the brain, to the more precise things like more precise biomarkers and blood-based biomarkers to really track those genomic kinds of things that are underlying the pathophysiology. And so, Bruce, I would like your kind of comments around this kind of longitudinal, the long-term kind of approach to kind of value assessment. And based on your recent work with Milliman in terms of looking at a longitudinal assessment of Alzheimer's disease, would there be a suitable tool for dementia and Alzheimer's that could also be an improvement for other conditions?
Certainly the broader approach of looking at the societal impact or the ecology around particular conditions would be applicable to many conditions. The classical HTA is perhaps best suited for acute events. Is this kind of approach to a hip joint replacement better than some other approach, for example? But I think an important long-term consideration of value is that value, a portion of value, should belong to society as a whole, or the public as a whole, public wealth. And the tendency, the willingness to pay doesn't capture that. There are precedents in a number of areas of policy in the US and elsewhere that identify a public and an asset share that belongs to the public. For example, a case involving quote unquote drug innovation, OxyContin and Purdue Pharma. The settlement there was distributed to not just the victims, but to other organizations. There was a notion of assets being distributed to the public. That was similar with the tobacco settlement. So I think building that concept, that long-term concept of not willingness to pay, but the public wealth, because if we're not adding to the public wealth, what's the point, right? So that's I think that's a part of the fundamentals that we have to in building a new system. The classical health economics models are, we have this treatment, you're now spending, $1 million on this treatment and you get lousy outcomes. So we have this treatment, you should pay us $1 million and you'll have better outcomes. That doesn't cut it. That, by the way, is why almost all of the work in QALYs and this kind of work has been funded by the pharma industry. We have to bring this more into the public health world.
Yeah, and I guess to kind of lean on that in terms of public health, and I know you've written pretty extensively on, social determinants of health, the intersection of kind of social disparities. And, Soren had mentioned about the value flower, and I think there's one kind of element around equity. And so we'd love your kind of thoughts on that, given some of the work that you've done in terms of like the value element of equity and how this is addressed or isn't addressed in HTA.
My work in that area has been U.S. centric, so I apologize that it may not be relevant to other segments, but other parts of the world. But in the U.S., we have an amazing ability to spend more and more money on healthcare, and our outcomes are getting worse and worse. And actually, the more we spend on healthcare, the worse our health gets, because it's siphoning money from things that are more important to health than healthcare, like education, like transportation, housing, food security, jobs. So the micro, and I'm saying that as to emphasize the importance of not looking at the microscopic view of a particular drug in particular patients. That the equity issue in the U.S., I think that is being recognized as not just affecting people who are suffering from disequities and disparities, but it actually is a drain on the entire system and hurts everybody. So I think that's the kind of broader thinking that is parallel to what my view of a better value system is.
Yeah, no, great. Thanks a lot, Bruce. And I think, if we've learned anything from COVID, it's that how different health events affect people differently. And, I think we also have to probably take this into consideration when we're looking at how dementia and, related Alzheimer's disease affects different parts of the population differently. And so, Soren, I'd like to kind of dig in a bit more in terms of your health affairs piece that was featured yesterday, discussing how cost effectiveness distorts innovation and really highlighting this kind of incrementalist nature. That I think you argue that, higher valuations are kind of being assigned to new drugs for diseases and conditions where the prices are already high, and lower valuations where existing prices are low. So how do you bridge this kind of incrementalist nature of CE modeling for innovations that are not kind of incremental, maybe as in the case for future disease modifying therapies?
Yeah, good question. And I don't want to propose that I have a perfect framework. And the attraction of cost effectiveness analysis was always that it was sort of consistent, right? Reproducible, applicable to all kinds of situations. But of course, there are these questions of validity and applicability. So I think the one thing that we do need to add is an assessment of the absolute contribution of a new treatment as opposed to the relative contribution. And we just have to understand like a more sort of holistic view of a new treatment. And interestingly enough, countries with more mature health technology assessment like France, Germany, Spain, and others, they do use cost effectiveness data. They just don't use them exclusively. I think in the US, there's now the strange perception that everybody else in the world is using strict cost effectiveness criteria to decide on whether a drug is worth it. And it comes to a surprise that not even NICE does this. NICE sort of gives adjustment for severe diseases, rare diseases. There was this cancer fund, which sort of acknowledged that as a unifying framework, cost effectiveness doesn't really work. And so we need to understand the value of a drug along different criteria: absolute value, scientific innovation. I think it's a much greater contribution to society if a drug treats a hitherto untreatable condition than if it makes a slight improvement to a treatable condition. There's the equity component. I mean, we have to face the fact that cost effectiveness is a utilitarian framework, so it maximizes overall social welfare. It doesn't give a damn about individual social welfare, and I think as a society we do. So maybe there is no unifying framework that brings all of that together in a simple statistic, but at least we should work towards sort of a broader view of value than what we currently have.
And you touched on a couple of countries, and I think these are countries that have known to kind of, as you kind of noted, combine a quantitative approach with a qualitative assessment. And as we know, a lot of kind of how do you kind of use qualitative assessment and marry it with a quantitative approach? How can you kind of reconcile those two things? Is it easy? Can it be done? Has it been done already? It'd be great to hear from you on that.
I mean, if you look at how GBA in Germany makes decisions, they take effectiveness, clinical effectiveness as the primary outcome of interest, then they sort of move through criteria like innovation, unmet need, and yes, value for money, and then sort of negotiate a price. And I think France is similar in that approach. The disadvantage is it's not as predictable and sort of clear cut because it's sort of a weighing of different attributes of a treatment. But I think it's in the absence of a replacement framework, it's sort of the best we can do at the moment.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Soren. So, I love that there's some ideas. There's countries that are kind of looking at different ways to marry these two. And so, David, would love your thoughts. So, you and Alzheimer's Research UK work directly with NICE. So how would you kind of approach an HTA body to kind of move them from maybe taking a more traditional approach to really expanding the way that they would approach value assessment for new DMTs?
Yeah, and it's definitely a challenge for some of the reasons that we've touched on. And I think particularly in the UK, obviously the role of NICE is that when they judge something cost effective, that means our health service needs to fund it. So it is obviously very important. I know that's not the same in all countries, but I guess we've been looking to marshal some of the arguments that we're making today about the shortcomings of the approach. NICE has been in place about 20 years, and you can argue that their methods haven't changed a huge amount since they were first founded. But I think we've been trying to make the case that you do need to evolve the approach that they've been taking, and I think we've found that particularly important to not just speak from a dementia perspective, but to bring other organisations together. So we work with a real range of patient organisations who both from the oncology space, but from the rare disease space as well, to kind of really set out where we see some of these shortcomings, to also reflect how medicine development is changing and how that's changed in the last 20, 30 years and some of the impacts of that, to talk about how the disease profile of the population has also changed. We all know that over the last 50 years in terms of more people living with long-term multiple conditions. So it's marshalling some of those arguments around that, and I think we've also worked with industry, given their interest in this space, and also with government as well. I think the UK government is very keen on the UK being seen as a leader in research, a leader in healthcare. So we've been working very hard to kind of marshal the arguments with the UK government around how NICE, with NICE changing how it works and looking to be a leading HTA agency that would be on the sort of front foot of these things. And that kind of has led to a groundswell, I would say, of a recognition that the way that NICE is working currently needs to change. And that's why at the moment NICE is conducting a really kind of far-reaching review of its methodology, which we've been very involved in working through. But it's certainly not a perfect process, and share a lot of certainly a lot of the views that Soren has expressed today. I'm very aligned with.
Yeah, no, and it seems to be, I think, aligned from the message I'm hearing from a lot of you, that you can't just talk about value or HTA or cost effectiveness merely with HTA bodies, right? That this is a bigger conversation with payers, those that are running healthcare systems, with governments, with industry that are developing these new treatments, to really try to somehow land, maybe not a consensus, but at least a kind of an aligned approach in terms of how you would marry the kind of quantitative and qualitative questions. So thank you all for your comments. And we actually have a really great question. It's posed to Soren, but I think if others want to weigh in, feel free. So great question from Sean Tunis, who is moderating the next panel, I believe, to Soren. What are your thoughts on quantifying those elements of value that are missing from traditional cost effectiveness analysis? For example, how would equity or scientific spillover be considered by modelers to adjust their determination of value-based prices?
Oh, yeah, if I knew that. We have an empirical approach developed here at USC to value equity. I'm not giving away the details because we are in submission of getting that funded. I don't have the slightest idea how to value scientific spillover, Sean. So if you want to give me a call, we can figure it out together, because this is really, really hard, but it's there. So it's sort of, there must be an empirical approach, probably drawing on like historical precedents like HIV or oncology, where initial treatments really were lousy, but they drew in money, they drew in talent. And I mean, today, most cancers, even in advanced stages, have evolved into a chronic disease, as has HIV, which was, when I was in medical school, a death sentence. how to operationalize this into value or willingness to pay, I'm at a loss at the moment.
Thanks, Soren. Anders, do you have an answer?
I had an analog hand here. I didn't find.
I like it.
I can't answer how to do it, but I think we can figure that out outside or within the cost effectiveness analysis, actually. But I wanted to, related to that is the uncertainty that we talked about and the lack of information, lack of data. I think one of the main problems there with spillovers, for instance, is that, yeah, we know they exist, but have we quantified them from the start? Do we know what the spillovers are? I'm hoping to do a study on for instance, the income and welfare effects on families with a person with Alzheimer's disease in their families. I think we could do a great study on that in the Nordics. I know they have done it on claims data in the US, but I haven't seen any in Europe. And that is an example of studies that we haven't really seen before. I think there's a lot to do on that area to sort of try to quantify what is the value of innovation, depending on sort of the characteristics of a treatment, of course. But then when you and have studied that, then it's easier to incorporate it into an evaluation of a specific drug.
What I'm sensing is there might be a nice collaborative research project in the works. So I think it's Anders, Soren, Sean, probably David and Bruce as well, if you want to connect. Oh, Bruce, you have a real, not an analog, but a digital hand up. Now, up to you.
Yeah, thanks. Just a couple of thoughts on innovation. As I had mentioned, some economists would consider the development of OxyContin as an innovation. So we have to be careful about what we think of as innovation. I would point out that in many industries, innovation has led to deflation, and is something that I've advocated for as a policy. The Japan approach to pharmaceuticals has that built in to some extent, and there's many precedents in other industries. But the challenge we have is actually, in the U.S. is lack of innovation. The incredible hassle we have adopting biosimilars, for example, is a failure of innovation. And frankly, when you add up the spending on some of the products that should have gotten off patent 10 years ago or more, that kind of dwarfs a lot of the money we're talking about. That's a U.S.-centric issue, but it's really failure to innovate by barriers to innovation that don't have a heck of a lot to do with value assessment. They have to do with various anti-competitive behavior. So I just want to put that out there as as contextual, because a lot of the background that we're trying to address deals with why we don't have money to spend for certain things. Well, it's because they're spending the money on other things. So just a contextual issue there. Thanks.
Great. So we're just nearing the end of our panel. Thanks, Bruce, and thanks, Sean, for that great question. I think it spurred a lot of debate. So thank you to all the panelists. But before we let you go, I wanted to ask just one last question. And this is more so to kind of end us on a kind of a note in terms of something that we can actually do. So each one of you, I'll start with David, take 30 seconds and let us know what's the one change that would have the most impact in ensuring we can effectively assess the value of future treatments for Alzheimer's disease. So David, you.
Just one. I think the one which I would focus on is on the impact of carers and understanding the quality of life measures for carers of people with dementia and how that can factor into any assessment. I think given the nature of this disease and the impact it has, on people who are looking after people with dementia, I think that is for me really fundamental that we find a better way of including that in value assessment.
Thanks, David. Bruce, too.
I would agree with David. The term I use is to define an ecology that surrounds Alzheimer's patients. But I agree with that defining that and quantifying it, and it can be quantified, that would be a important step forward.
Super. And Soren, to you.
It might surprise you, but I'm actually into better data because there's so many items that we don't really know all that well in terms of especially attributable cost and attributable burden, because a dementia patient has very high medical cost, but not necessarily because of the dementia, but because they are just old and sick. So we really need to have a better understanding of that, of the specific contribution of cognitive decline, neuropsychiatric systems on caregivers, on medical costs, on nursing home admission, as opposed to all the other things that many of our Alzheimer patients suffer from, to actually sort of isolate the value of a treatment, however we operationalize that value.
Great, thanks, Soren. And Anders, to end us.
I'm happy to say that in the end, I'm all with Soren. I think it's all about data, and I'd like to see a European-wide register on Alzheimer's treatment, Alzheimer patients, starting from preclinical, if you can, but then following them over time, so that we have a longitudinal database to build on, and then we can compare to that once we get a treatment on the market.
Great. Thanks a lot, Anders. So we're now at the end of our panel. Thanks to our amazing panelists for the energy they brought to the discussion, for pushing us to think differently. We really hope to keep this important conversation going. So we're now going to go to a 15-minute brain break. When we come back, we'll hear payer and HTA perspectives from around the world on real-world evidence requirements and standards for Alzheimer's interventions. So see you at 4:15 in Europe, and for our American colleagues at 10:15 Eastern.